At 6:47 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, a classified diplomatic signal left the White House Situation Room and triggered what several senior security officials are already calling the most dangerous rupture in U.S.-Canada relations in more than half a century. Within minutes, Washington insiders confirmed that President Joe Biden had issued a 48-hour ultimatum to Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, demanding immediate clarification over a rapidly expanding Arctic energy corridor near the Beaufort Sea. Newly mapped geological surveys indicate the region could contain more than $412 billion in recoverable oil, natural gas, and rare earth minerals, a discovery powerful enough to redraw global energy supply chains for the next generation. But the escalation did not stop there. By 7:19 a.m., emergency policy teams inside the U.S. Department of Energy began preparing targeted export restrictions on advanced drilling software, AI-driven geological modeling systems, and satellite exploration networks, technology that currently supports nearly 63% of Canada's Arctic resource extraction capacity. Then the military signal appeared. Defense officials confirmed that 12,000 NATO rapid response troops are being repositioned across strategic northern bases in Alaska, Greenland, and Norway, part of an accelerated Arctic security posture that analysts say could reshape control over the polar energy frontier. Yet the corporate media continues to describe this as a simple trade dispute. It is not. Inside Washington, policy strategists are already modeling 3 potential collapse scenarios for Canada's Arctic energy strategy if Ottawa refuses to comply before the 48-hour deadline expires. If you want to understand what is really unfolding before the official narrative is rewritten, subscribe now. The mainstream media is already hours behind this story, and what you are about to see could redefine the geopolitical future of the Arctic. To understand why this situation escalated so quickly and why policymakers in Washington are suddenly treating an Arctic energy project as a strategic emergency, we need to step back and examine the mechanics of what is actually unfolding behind the scenes. In this analysis, I will guide you through 3 critical demands that Washington has quietly placed on Ottawa within the 48-hour ultimatum, and why each of those demands targets a different pillar of Canada's Arctic energy strategy. Next, I will break down 4 cascading consequences that could ripple across global energy markets if this confrontation continues to escalate. Consequences that could affect everything from North American supply chains to NATO's long-term Arctic defense posture. After that, we will examine the strategic leverage the United States actually holds in this standoff, including control over advanced extraction technology, satellite exploration infrastructure, and the financial systems that underpin billions of dollars in Arctic development. And finally, I will lay out 3 realistic geopolitical scenarios that could unfold when the 48-hour deadline expires, ranging from a negotiated compromise to a complete rupture in US-Canada energy cooperation. Because once you see how these pieces connect together, the events unfolding today in the Arctic stop looking like a simple policy disagreement and start looking like the opening phase of a much larger geopolitical shift. To understand why Washington moved so quickly this morning, we need to examine the structural pressures behind the Arctic energy corridor and why the United States suddenly views this development as a strategic vulnerability rather than a routine energy partnership. There are 4 critical factors driving the current crisis. Factor 1, the Arctic energy shock. The first factor is the scale of the discovery itself. According to internal geological assessments circulating among North American energy regulators, the Beaufort Sea basin may contain over $412 billion in commercially viable hydrocarbons and rare earth elements. That number alone would already place the Arctic among the most valuable untapped energy regions in the world. But the strategic shock comes from how quickly Canada moved to operationalize those reserves. Satellite mapping data collected over the past 12 months indicates that Canadian exploration zones expanded by nearly 37% across the Arctic shelf, accompanied by new deep-water drilling permits and logistical infrastructure across northern territories. Energy economists warn that if Canada successfully develops these reserves at full capacity, it could introduce up to 1.8 million barrels of new daily production into global markets within 10 years. That level of output would significantly alter North American energy leverage, especially as the Arctic increasingly becomes a contested geopolitical frontier. Former U.S. Energy Secretary Ernest Moniz recently warned in a policy forum that Arctic energy development is no longer simply an environmental or economic issue. It has become a strategic competition over who controls the next generation of energy corridors, and that is where Washington's concern begins to intensify. Factor 2, technology dependence. Technology. The second factor is technological leverage. Despite Canada's vast natural resources, much of its advanced Arctic extraction capability still depends on American-developed technology systems. These include AI-driven geological modeling platforms used to map underwater reserves, deep-water drilling control software used in extreme polar environments, high-resolution satellite exploration systems operated through U.S. aerospace networks. Energy infrastructure analysts estimate that these technologies support approximately 63% of Canada's Arctic resource development operations, which means Washington possesses a powerful strategic tool: technological restriction. If the United States blocks access to these systems, even temporarily, it could delay Canadian energy expansion projects by 3 to 5 years, according to projections from several Arctic policy institutes. This is why the emergency export restrictions reportedly being drafted this morning are not just economic pressure. They are structural leverage over Canada's energy timeline. If you are starting to understand the magnitude of this pressure, press like now, because this is the point where the situation begins to shift from policy disagreement to geopolitical power play. Factor 3, the Arctic security dimension. The third factor is military positioning. Energy discoveries in the Arctic rarely remain purely economic developments for long. As soon as large-scale resource corridors emerge, they quickly become linked to national security calculations. Control of Arctic infrastructure means control of shipping routes, communication corridors, and strategic maritime access between North America, Europe, and Asia. That is why defense analysts are paying close attention to the sudden repositioning of 12,000 NATO rapid response troops across northern bases in Alaska, Greenland, and Norway. Officially, this movement is described as a routine Arctic readiness posture. However, several retired military commanders have suggested that the repositioning serves a secondary purpose, signaling strategic deterrence. Retired U.S. Navy Admiral James Stavridis, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander Europe, has repeatedly argued that Arctic competition will define the next era of geopolitical rivalry. In one strategic briefing, he warned that control of Arctic infrastructure may determine who dominates the future polar trade routes and energy corridors emerging as ice coverage continues to recede, which means the military component of this crisis may be less about Canada itself and more about ensuring that Arctic energy development remains aligned with Western strategic interests. Factor 4, financial shockwaves. The fourth factor involves global financial markets. Energy discoveries of this magnitude do not remain isolated to one country's economy. They ripple through commodity markets, energy futures, and investment flows worldwide. Several investment banks have already begun modeling potential market impacts if the Arctic Energy Corridor becomes operational under Canadian leadership. One scenario suggests that new Arctic output could push global oil price volatility up by as much as 18% over the next decade, particularly if the development disrupts existing production coordination between major energy exporters. Billionaire investor Warren Buffett once remarked that energy infrastructure determines the long-term direction of industrial economies. When a new energy corridor emerges, it does not simply change supply levels. It reconfigures the strategic map of economic power. That is why Washington's response appears so unusually rapid. Because from the perspective of policymakers in the Situation Room, this is not just about a Canadian development project. It is about who ultimately shapes the future architecture of Arctic energy control. And that brings us to the most important question. What happens when the 48-hour ultimatum expires? Now we arrive at the moment where everything becomes uncertain. The 48-hour deadline issued from Washington is not simply a diplomatic formality. Deadlines like this are designed to force decisions under pressure, and when that clock runs out, the geopolitical consequences tend to unfold quickly. Right now, analysts inside several policy institutes are modeling 3 possible scenarios that could emerge once the ultimatum expires. Scenario 1, full strategic concession. The first scenario is the most stabilizing outcome, though it may also be the most politically difficult for Ottawa. In this scenario, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau agrees to Washington's demands, either by slowing the Arctic energy project or restructuring the development agreements under a framework acceptable to the United States. This could involve limiting foreign investment in the Arctic corridor, granting American energy firms a larger operational role, or placing portions of the development under joint North American security oversight. If this path unfolds, markets would likely stabilize quickly. Energy investors prefer predictability, and a coordinated US-Canada approach to Arctic resources would reassure both NATO allies and global financial markets. However, such a concession would carry domestic consequences for Trudeau. Critics inside Canada would almost certainly argue that Ottawa surrendered strategic energy sovereignty under American pressure, and that political backlash could reshape Canada's internal energy debate for years. Scenario 2, partial compliance. The second scenario is more ambiguous and potentially more volatile. In this case, Canada does not fully abandon its Arctic energy strategy, but instead offers limited concessions designed to buy time while preserving its long-term plans. Ottawa could agree to enhance transparency measures, allow joint monitoring of Arctic infrastructure, or temporarily delay certain phases of exploration. At first glance, this might appear to resolve the crisis, but partial compliance often creates prolonged geopolitical tension rather than genuine resolution. Washington could continue applying technological pressure through export restrictions. Investment uncertainty could slow the pace of Arctic development, and both governments might enter a period of quiet strategic competition beneath the surface of public diplomacy. Energy markets dislike uncertainty even more than conflict. If this middle path unfolds, global investors may begin recalculating the reliability of future Arctic supply forecasts. Scenario 3, strategic rupture. The third scenario is the one that policymakers fear the most. If Ottawa refuses the ultimatum entirely and continues expanding the Arctic energy corridor, Washington could escalate its response through economic, technological, and strategic pressure. The export restrictions currently being drafted could take effect within days, immediately disrupting Canadian access to key drilling technologies and satellite exploration systems. At the same time, the United States could strengthen its Arctic military presence, signaling that the region has shifted from an economic frontier into a strategic security zone. Under those conditions, cooperation between the two countries on Arctic infrastructure could fracture, creating a long-term rivalry over energy development, shipping routes, and polar resource access. Such a rupture would not only reshape North American energy dynamics, it could redefine who ultimately controls the economic future of the Arctic. And once geopolitical competition enters the Arctic at that level, it rarely reverses quickly. Right now, the clock is quietly ticking toward the end of that 48-hour deadline, and what happens when it expires could permanently alter the strategic relationship between the United States and Canada. For decades, the two countries have operated as some of the closest security and economic partners in the world. But moments like this reveal how quickly alliances can shift when energy, technology, and geopolitical leverage collide in the same region. The Arctic is no longer just a remote frontier of ice and exploration. It is becoming one of the most important energy and strategic corridors of the 21st century. Whoever shapes its development will influence shipping routes, resource markets, and the balance of economic power across the Northern Hemisphere. And that is why this confrontation matters so much. If Trudeau backs down, Canada risks appearing strategically dependent on Washington. If he refuses, the alliance itself could enter a new phase of quiet but serious competition over Arctic control. The question now is simple. Has Washington pushed too far, or is Canada taking a strategic risk it cannot afford? Let me know what you think. Leave your analysis in the comments because I read every perspective. And if you want to follow the next developments in this unfolding Arctic crisis, subscribe and turn on notifications because the next 48 hours could reshape the geopolitical future of the North.